Hello, welcome again to the Valley's people. Today we're going to meet a man whose voice has been heard right throughout the Hunter Valley for some time through radio, but also has become something of a radio expert in Australia generally. Also from Dudley, an aviation enthusiast, but the kind that just doesn't enjoy flying. He likes that real helmet, goggles, and sort of head out the window kind of flying, which you can do in a Tiger Moth. And he's a world expert on that subject. I hope you can stay and join us when we meet two more interesting people today from this valley. Thanks for joining us today. There aren't too many radio personalities in the Hunter Valley. In fact, there's only one. And there aren't too many radio personalities in Australia who can claim to have a best-selling LP at the same time as carrying on as radio announcer on a favourite station. Well, that applies to David Jones from 2NX. David and the Derros, a hit single. And our first guest today in the Valley's People is David Jones. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Ron.
David and the Derros. How would you select a name like that?
Well, I've always had this terrible fear of one day winding up as one, you see. So I figured that if I kind of invented this character who could encompass the role that I might take in the future, but get it over now, out of my system, the future would be clear for me.
Yes, you can develop the future, but having a number 5 record in reality today is a harder job, isn't it?
That all came out of Melbourne, as a matter of fact, David Derros. It was a creation of a friend of mine from 3XY, the radio station I was working at in Melbourne, and myself. And we used to fool around in the studio after hours and knock up imitations of rock bands and what have you, and put satirical lyrics to these songs. And he came up with a thing once called Death to Disco, which was a number 5 selling song in Melbourne, you see. And I thought, hello, there could be a quid in this. Yeah. At the time, though, I must point out all of the proceeds from Death to Disco went to an appeal for kids and underprivileged kids at that in Melbourne, to raise money for them for a Christmas appeal. So it did some good in that respect, I think.
Yes, yeah. That's a long, long way from, I think, your basic interest in music, which I'm told goes to things like oboe, piano, theory.
When I first began in radio, I developed a kind of I suppose because of some of the music I was playing at the time, which wasn't what I really liked when I was a panel operator in Melbourne radio back in the early 60s. And I discovered this honest love for what they call classical music. And it became such a kind of an overwhelming passion with me. I began studying the theory and the practicality of music. And I played the oboe, studied theory and piano for a while. Wrote a couple of orchestral pieces. They weren't mind-bending, nor were they world beaters, but it was an experience, something I'd like to have carried on.
But you had a leaning towards composing.
Definitely.
Serious music.
Sure, yeah.
Do you still have that?
I have the interest in music and the love of music, Ron, but not the desire or I think the talent now. I'm a bit too old, I guess, to kind of put those things into practice, you know. To become a practicing composer now would be out of the question entirely.
Yes. It's a full circle, though, isn't it? From the classics, the oboe, the piano,
conservatorium. It's a nice shame about the face, yeah. Yeah, although it's funny how when I first started, I was very narrow in my taste when I got to love so-called classical music. The whole thing was a bit narrow. I tended to kind of believe what I was listening to was the epitome of music, you know. Now I like music at both scales, heavy rock music, heavy so-called, again, classical music.
Yeah, it's a shame there aren't more people like that, really, because people tend to be intolerant, don't they, of their music tastes?
Narrow in their tastes, sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, you're a little bit of an enigma, aren't you, in radio circles, because you've been on air, you've become a program manager or program director at 3XY in Melbourne.
That's
and
right,
in fact, I think you can claim that you took it back to number 1.
Well,
let's claim it anyway.
I'll claim it, sure.
Of course.
Why not? Yeah.
No, well, it's fair. It's a fair claim because you were there and you worked hard for a couple of years and you took it back, and then you decided to come back to the Hunter Valley. This is sort of your home. Eh?
Prior to that, I was on air in Melbourne at XY as a breakfast jock for about a year and a half also during that period, which I enjoyed immensely. And I had good ratings down there. I had ratings that would keep you in a job, put it that way, but the lure of the Hunter was always in the back of my mind. I had a house in Newcastle. My wife's parents were in Newcastle. And I just honestly, it sounds patronising to say it, but I do love Newcastle, the people, the style of life here, and it was always in the back of my mind to come back here.
Yes, a lot of people may not appreciate just how keen the strength of the Hunter Valley breakfast announcer is. I mean, without getting too involved in this, you've got people like, and people that have been on the show, like Pat Barton of 2KO and Jeff Moore of the ABC and yourself of 2NX. They have incredible standing within the Australian radio system, and yet they pine to be here in the Hunter Valley rather than to go off other places.
That's the lure of the Hunter, Ron, as I mentioned, the lure of Newcastle. There's something about it.
Yeah, you also received the accolade for being the best air personality outside of capital city. When was that? Just a couple of years ago?
No, it was in this year actually. They hold a radio and records convention, which in fact I've seen Mr. Ron Hurst speak at a couple of times in past years, I can recall.
Yeah, very, very shaky applause at the end.
No, I thought you were excellent.
A little too controversial.
No, honestly, it was controversial, I'll give you that. Yes, they have a radio and records convention, as you know, each June, and this year was the first I'd not been able to make in all the 7 or 8 years that had been running. And I think I'd been nominated for a category each of these years, including this year. This year's I couldn't make, and I picked up an award for the best air personality for stations outside the capital stations. Yeah.
I'd like to take you back a little bit further than just a couple of years ago, David. In fact, I'm going to take you back to 1973, because I have a tape here that you may not have heard for ages. It's a morning on 2NX. It's around about 7 o'clock. The year is 1973. Have a listen.
It's the wedding song, There Is Love. It's 14 to 7 at 2NX. Good morning. How are you? Nice and fit? I certainly hope so. At the moment, we have something like 14 degrees at the moment.
Now, you remember now, because after that you woke up in hospital.
Yeah. The reason I screamed is I always hated that record, actually. No.
A little more serious than that, I know.
That was, actually, I'm epileptic. That was the first time it came out, of all places, on the radio at 6:45 in the morning. In May '73, as you pointed out. All of a sudden, I took one of these seizures. I had 3 or 4 since then. It's been arrested by the controls of harmless drugs. And I've done a bit of work here and there around Australia, Melbourne and Newcastle in particular, for epileptics who have a similar problem. But what happened that morning, I was playing the record, as you heard, at 6:45. I'd had a late night watching a play the night before by Tennessee Williams, I think. It's a very boring play, I might point out, so it wasn't really worth it. And I was tired when I got to work and started the show, and from memory, gee, you've really jogged my memory here, Ron, that's a long time back.
Yeah, 73.
I can recall waking up in hospital. What happened there, actually, when that actual seizure, that grand mal seizure, as it's called in epileptic terms, took place, one of the newsreaders was driving to work, and he heard this happen and presumed there'd been an electrocution, which you know, ostensibly could happen in a radio station.
Right.
So he ordered 2 ambulances, thinking that his brain.
So that explains the groan that we hear in that tape.
That groan wasn't a scream of agony as much as it's the air being, so I'm told by the experts, right, the air being compressed from your lungs.
Oh, I see.
An outward gesture like that from your lungs. So it's not actually a scream of pain. There is no pain as such. It's purely a total blackout thing. And through the control of drugs and through constant sort of medical attention for a couple of years, I was able to arrest this problem, I think, quite successfully.
Well, I understand there are 2 stages of epilepsy. There's the petit mal and then the grand mal. So you've hit the jackpot.
I hit the jackpot, the big one.
Yes.
Probably, I would imagine, the only time on radio ever in the world, maybe, that a person's had a grand mal seizure.
Yes, I think so. It's not the thing you want to lay claim to, though, I guess.
Well, I was considering writing the Guinness Book of Records.
But David, on the more serious side of the after effects of that, you seem to develop a very strong association then with the Association for Epilepsy, and you've been doing a lot of work in that regard. What have you studied and what have you found?
Well, it really began not so much in Newcastle. Newcastle was the gestation period, basically, with that thing. For a start, I had to have the necessary medical sort of experiments and what have you that they do on people who have these problems. When I went to Melbourne, I took this a stage further, and once it was actually ascertained that in fact I was epileptic and I had this grand mal thing, I joined the Epileptic Society down there.
Yes.
compared numerous concerts and things. Appeared on television down there with Tony Gregg, who's a fellow sufferer of this thing. If you can call it suffer, I've never really suffered terribly from it.
I think the bowlers suffer more, really, don't they?
I think so. So I put a fair bit of hard work into the association down there. And only recently in Newcastle has there actually been something established up here along the same lines. And I'm very happy to say that in my very small way and with the small problem I've had with the illness, I'm able to help in some respects.
Yes. Why I think you've had so many, sort of strange incidents in your life, when you take epilepsy for one,
Yeah.
and being a radio announcer, telling everyone else to be bright and cheerful and
Yeah.
wearing it. And then, apart from that, a recording artist, David and the Derros. But then also to find yourself, of all places, in the United Kingdom, on a broadcast called the Teddy Bear's Picnic, takes really some unfathoming.
You find some gems out, Mr. Hurst. I'll give you that one. This took place when I was in Melbourne at 3XY in mid-78. And an airline approached, no names here?
No, doesn't matter.
British Airways approached me,
Right.
which is quite in keeping anyhow. Approached myself and a Sydney disc jockey to go to Longleat, which is the home of Lord Bath, you see. He's a very publicity-minded gentleman because he can't afford to pay his taxes as well as he used to. He's got this enormous property over there, acres and acres. He's got lions, he's got the original Doctor Who sets in the basement, and they decided to hold the world's first teddy bear rally because the British hold teddy bears very much to their heart. And I went across there and broadcast from Longleat back to XY, and subsequently, for a week after that, some broadcasting from London back to XY as well.
You find things a little different there for broadcasting. Yes.
Totally,
Yes, yeah.
Although, it's with satellite communications backwards and forwards, I was able to monitor the entire program back at XY and the whole thing, so it's quite remarkable what can be done.
I suppose your wife being a guide leader too helps you keep in touch with the Hunter Valley?
Yeah, that and the fact that I do a lot of comparing work around the place as well, I do a lot of comparing work around the place, which I enjoy thoroughly. It's contact with your audience out there, and the fact that you can speak to people directly is something that I would never miss the opportunity of doing.
Well, if your wife's at home talking about girl guiding, and you're talking about composing, playing the oboe,
Not all the
piano,
time.
rock and roll, David and the Derros, radio announcing, just how does all this fit into one David Jones?
Well, I see a psychiatrist 3 times a week. No, I'm just a person that likes to kind of absorb as much as I can. Quite often too much, I think. That's one of my problems. I think I've got to go 100 miles at things, where I should be maybe approaching at 60 miles an hour,
Yes, a lot of people would have the impression that being a breakfast announcer in the Hunter Valley with so much competition, even close to major cities like Sydney and so on, would be a worrying time, that you'd, after a couple of years, want to give the whole thing away. How do you react to the pressure which is undoubtedly there upon you to always come up with good ratings, morning after morning, year after year?
The way I react is to work, and that's the only answer I can give is to work hard, Ron. And I sincerely believe I do that. I work as hard as I possibly can. Maybe I should work harder, but I do work. And I believe that is the sole answer that I could give with any authority or truthfulness.
Fine. David Jones, 2NX, thank you very much for being with us today on The Valley's People.
Thank you, Ron.
And I'll be back in just a moment with our next guest. Welcome back to the show. A lot of people are aviation enthusiasts, but I think our next guest can really claim to be Australia's greatest aviation enthusiast, if not one of the greatest in the world, and that's Bill Hitchcock from Dudley. Bill, of course, do they call you Wild Bill Hitchcock?
Many people do, Ron, many people do. It's a nickname that I got years ago in the old Aero Club Broadmeadow days. And, of course, Hitchcock and Hickok sounds very much the same,
Right.
the Wild West character. And, I was known as Wild Bill. A lot of people still come up and say, how are you, Wild Bill? I don't mind.
Not quite your lifestyle, I understand. It's a little more passive and all that.
Oh, of course.
But Bill, the part about being of aviation enthusiast of world standing intrigues me, because the more and more we do this program, the more and more I realise that we've got so many people that are world recognised right in the middle of the Hunter Valley. It becomes so enthralling. and you are a commentator for what one could say is the world's biggest air show in Oshkosh. You're renowned for articles on aviation. You're the foundation president, is it, of the Tiger Moth Club of Australia. You are director of the Royal Newcastle Aero Club. I guess you could go on and on about your articles in aircraft and other magazines. But what really started this fascination between you and the aircraft?
Oh, well, back in the 1930s, I can remember my mother and father taking me to the early air pageants at Broadmeadow, the previous home of the Aero Club. And the colour of in those days, the aircraft always painted bright colours. And the colour and the noise of the whole setup fascinated me. And I was always interested in aeroplanes, right through the war years, you know, and afterwards. And of course, naturally, I ended up joining Royal Newcastle Aero Club. And I went solo in Tiger Moths in 1955. And of course, from that came a great love affair with the Tiger Moth as well.
Yes, I can remember my father taking me on my 10th birthday to the District Park Aero Club and giving me a ride in a Tiger Moth. And I think I've been fascinated with them ever since, but not to the extent that you are, because you are a recognised expert on the Tiger Moth. Why do you think the Tiger Moth and the Hunter Valley are sort of so synonymous?
Well, in 1936, the first Tiger Moth was brought to Australia for an RAAF evaluation, a trainer evaluation. And when the Air Force had finished with the evaluation, the aircraft was put on the market. And it was bought by the old Newcastle Aero Club as it was then. So in 1936, the Newcastle Aero Club took delivery of Australia's first Tiger Moth. Now, ever since then, right up to today, there's been a Tiger Moth at Newcastle Aero Club, even through the war years. The old Broadmeadow workshops, the engineers were kept working. They worked on all the Air Force Tiger Moths and the Wacket trainers, and they even built mosquito bomber wingtips. That's a fact that a lot of people wouldn't know.
Oh, really?
So the Tiger Moth is synonymous with the Hunter Valley.
Yeah. And how did you get all these people together from over Australia to form a club?
Oh, well, as soon as you mentioned the Tiger Moth, as I saw your eyes shining a few minutes ago, people become very, very interested. It's the old type flying, the old open cockpit, the wind in the wires, no brakes, biplane. It goes back to 1914, 1918, and nearly everyone, you know, would like to think that he's the Red Baron or somebody exciting like that.
I wonder how you cope with those people that are terrified by flying now, because you can't hang your head out of a jumbo, can you? No. Experience all that great excitement of aircraft travel.
Oh no, it's a totally different feeling. This is why even now, if people go out for a joyride in the Aero Club's Tiger Moth, they get out of the aeroplane with their eyes shining, and that was great. And it's totally different to being in the envelope of a cabin aeroplane. You know?
Right. Now, how did you get to this position of being the chief commentator almost for Australia of air shows? So you...
Well, I started at our air shows, and of course I started going to America in 1974, leading groups of pilots every year to the big EAA, that's Experimental Aircraft Association, air show at Oshkosh in Wisconsin. And that is the biggest air show in the world. And in 1979, the leader of the EAA, Paul Poborezny, was in Australia. And he happened to be at one of the air shows I was doing a commentary for. It was at Barrel, where we had the triplane and the Sopwith Pup. It was a real colourful show. And Paul said to me that day, he said, "Bill, you've been coming over for all these years and you've never told us that you were an air show commentator." He said, "From now on, you're taking the stand at Oshkosh." So later that year in '79, I did my first commentaries at Oshkosh. And of course this year I played a big part. We had the American Tiger Moths there this year and I did all the commentaries. And of course we had the Australian aircraft there this year that had flown over in the Oshkosh Express, the jumbo jet, the Qantas Jumbo. And I had a lot to do with that also. So, you know, the air show thing now is quite a big part of my life. And it's show business, you know.
I have to say the bit of show business. Those are a photo of you with a slouch hat at Oshkosh. I mean, how did the Yanks take to that?
Well, I did that as a gimmick in 1974. I know it sounds terribly corny, but the Americans loved it. And a couple of years ago, I didn't wear it on one occasion, and the chaps on the main gate said, "Bill, you're not coming in, Wild Bill. You haven't got that slouch hat on." You know, they love it. You know, now I go every year. I'm going again next year. It'll be my 9th trip. And Oshkosh, well, it's a funny sounding name. A lot of people say, "What the heck's Oshkosh?" Actually, it's the name of the Indian chief who frequented that area 100 years ago. He was the chief of the Indians, Chief Oshkosh. And they have a marvellous statue of him looking out over Lake Winnebago. And,
it's in Wisconsin, isn't it?
Oh, yes, which is the daring state. Beautiful country. And the home of the EAA, and the people of Wisconsin, you know, they're just plain crazy.
Well, how many people there at the air show to hear Wild Bill's commentary?
Well, for the week, the show goes from Saturday to Saturday, and incidentally there are 4 American commentators, myself and an Englishman, Harold Best-Devereaux. And during that week there are 750,000 people who attend throughout the week. Each day, there's a different show each day.
Yes. You've received a medal from the Royal Federation of Aero Clubs, haven't you, for service to the Aero Club movement throughout the world? And I understand it's a Reg Ansett and you, is it?
Oh, in 1976 I received the Royal Federation of Aero Clubs medal, and that year Reg Ansett received one also for his services to aviation. I'm very proud of it. It was a recognition of the work that I've put in over the years, you know, in the Aero Club movement. And, well, you know, it's not every day you get a medal.
Right. Amateur theatre's played such a part of your life. Does that combine with your commentary work?
Oh, yes, yes. Well, as I said earlier, it's showbiz. It's showbiz. Many years ago, I played in many amateur theatrical productions in Newcastle, mainly at the City Hall. And my wife's a well-known actress too, Val. And I try and combine the theatre with our tiger moths, because there is something theatrical about the tiger moth. And I always feel there's also something similar with the smell of grease paint and the smell of aircraft dope. They both come from colourful environments. And
how do you mean there's something theatrical about a tiger moth?
well, we do stage theatrical shows with the tiger moth involved, like Biggles and the Desert Patrol. Could you think of anything more theatrical than Biggles going on the Desert Patrol, fighting the Arabs, dropping bombs, rescuing a fair maiden?
And you stage all that, don't you?
Oh yes, we've done this in the air show.
Choreography by Bill Hitchcock.
That's right.
That's fascinating. What are some of the other gimmicks you've done with that plane?
Well, we've used the Tiger. You know, the Tiger, of course, it was a wing-walking aeroplane. We've never been allowed to do that, and I would very much love to be able to do it with the aeroplane. But at this stage,
Flying or walking?
Well, both.
Really?
Marry me, but it's done at Oshkosh every year. Of course, they do aerobatics with somebody on the wing, and the old Tiger just hasn't got the power to do that. But the New Zealand Tiger Club, the English Tiger Club, they all do the wing walking. Well, it's not wing walking, it's a wing stand with a girl usually standing on the fuel tank, on a frame that bolts onto the fuel tank. And at this stage they won't allow us to do that. I'm hopeful that one day they will allow us to do it, because I've got the plans for the frame, and there are quite a lot of fair maidens in Newcastle who would be happy to jump on the wing of an aeroplane, it appears.
You're kidding.
I'll tell you, I've mentioned this a few times, and there are girls who have said, gee, let me know when you get permission to do this, because I want to be the first, you know. but the aeroplane, you know, for banner towing, balloon busting and flower bombing and all that sort of thing, you know, it's all theatrical stuff that the Tiger has been involved with over the years. Even in England, Sir Alan Cobham's Flying Circus, they used to pick up handkerchiefs from the ground with the wingtip. The Tiger moth.
Yeah, you've done more than just stage a few air shows, though, Bill, aren't you? You're involved in restoration work, you're involved in finding these aircraft and preserving them. That must be pretty intriguing work.
Yes, well, the Warbirds Museum Group is headquartered at the club, and we have a Navy Sea Venom jet, which we tendered $100 for a few years ago, and we obtained that, and our chief engineer restored it, repainted it. We've got that on display. We've got a Spitfire engine and an Armstrong Cheetah out of an SP Oxford, propeller off the old Sikorsky Kingfisher float plane, and we can stage a very interesting little museum set up at any stage with the gear that we've got. And of course, when I go to America every year, I visit all the leading air museums. I've been to the Washington Museum and to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is the biggest museum in the world, and the Washington Museum would be probably the best presented. And also to Old Rhinebeck. Now, Old Rhinebeck is just outside of New York, and a gentleman named Cole Palin owns this airfield, and he features there all the World War I aeroplanes and flies them, the old cast Royal burning rotary-engined aeroplanes. Really? And it's a magnificent show to go and see, and of course for me it's brilliant, you know.
You've just downgraded my aeroplane scrapbook I had when I was a kid. All the work that you've done there. Bill, thank you very much for appearing on the program today, because I wanted to meet you. Your work is now, you know, famous right throughout the world, and particularly here in the Hunter Valley, you're certainly the aviation enthusiast, which is in fact preserving aviation for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
Bill Hitchcock, aviation enthusiast, and I'll be back in just a moment in the Valley's People. Well, as a result of today's program, I think whenever we hear David Jones now on air, we'll know a little more about him. And also, if we're inclined to go flying in Tiger moths, then let's hope that Bill Hitchcock is flying it, because he's one of the rare enthusiasts of the Hunter Valley, and a man, of course, now world famous on that subject. I hope you can join us again when we meet two more interesting people from the Hunter Valley. Goodbye for now.